So we're going to bring it together into a panel discussion now on transport funding, and we will try and incorporate some of those questions that you have been sending through into the panel itself, which is going to be moderated by Sarah Sinclair, who is a partner at MinterEllisonRuddWatts. Please give her a warm welcome.
I think I sit with you. Here. Okay, well, welcome all. Welcome to the wonderful 3 p.m. slot, at least on the first day this time, and the Transport Financing and Funding panel, a model for New Zealand. If I could just start by introducing the panel, starting directly on my right, Rob Ward from MUFG Bank, Raynor McMahon from Westpac Institutional, Grant McKeown from China Construction Bank, and John Paul Rice from Russell McVeagh. So I want to start with some scene setting, and we're going to start at a 101. Amazingly, we're going to start with a definition of funding versus financing. The basic definition, of course, funding is revenue. It comes from a number of sources, from government, from users with tolls and tariffs, and from other revenues, and we've seen a bit of that today, like value capture and commercial revenues. Financing is the money that's borrowed now to pay for the thing, but we need those revenues to pay it back. What I want to start with the panel is this well understood, and why are we still talking about the definition? Raynor.
Oh, thanks. No, I don't think it's well understood. I think it's constantly confused in the media. I think New Zealand's financial literacy generally is not that high. I mean, this morning there was potentially a bit of a miscommunication with Minister Twyford, where he did confuse funding and financing. Maybe we need to call it revenue and capital or something different, but no, certainly I don't think it's that well understood.
You still having the discussion in Australia, Rob?
Oh yeah, it's ongoing. I think Australia and everywhere else around the world, and I think it's got a discussion that needs to keep occurring, because the distinction between the two is critically important if we're going to put the right infrastructure in place.
So to continue with the scene setting, we're going to structure this panel around the 3 key elements of funding and financing. And this is what we're going to call the 3 key elements. The first are the funding mechanisms themselves, and we've seen quite a bit of that from John's and the other presentations just before. The second key element is the role of government as both local and central, as the procurer, as funder, and as borrower. And the third key element is the lenders. Of course, these are all linked. A clear funding source or sources must be present to support the finance. But I want to look at each of those elements, and that's why we're going to run through now. I'm going to start with key element number 1, the funding mechanisms, and I'm starting positive. We're going to move into something more controversial. So we've seen a number of funding mechanisms in the mix. We've seen a presentation on value capture, Stephen's presentation, we've got the regional fuel tax, we have targeted rates. Can I ask, starting with you, Rob, what funding models are used offshore and are you seeing in Australia that actually successfully deliver projects?
Okay, well, I think we tend to look at it in both macro and micro. There's actual funding mechanisms for a specific project, and then there's a general use of alternative funding models that's employed elsewhere. Obviously, we've gone through a lot of stuff today around value capture, tolls, targeted rates, all these kind of mechanisms, and they basically, and user pays, of which tolls is a source, a portion, fare box, etc. And then you've got just government coffers. And one of the challenges is that in most projects, particularly in the transport space, no one of these mechanisms actually will fund an entire project for you. I was noted with interest references to things like Crossrail earlier on, where approximately 31% of the overall required funding for the project came from value capture. In Australia, we generally work off a rule of thumb about 30% coming from fare box for public transport maximum. So between those two, you might have about 60%, and then you're really left with general government resource for the remainder of the funding. So at the more macro level, probably the best example I can think of is in New South Wales in recent years. We've had the asset recycling initiatives and that's been applied in Victoria as well, where at a macro level the government's taken a decision, well, we're going to be up for a significant amount of the infrastructure spend. It's going to have to be funded from government. We've got a lot of assets that we have, and we've decided, and the decision's been taken to recycle. So in New South Wales we saw privatisations or concessions handed out. The Restart New South Wales scheme producing about $33 billion to put that into that funding. And now we see an infrastructure spend of about $85 billion over the next 4 years, of which 50 odd are in transport. And none of that would be happening in its entirety without that sort of forward thinking and sort of more macro level to the funding. So they're just some of the examples we see.
I want to delve into the role of government a bit later, but Grant, what mechanisms have you seen and things you've funded offshore that you think is a good mix?
Yeah, I think in taking the Asia context, I think the value capture, which we've touched on here today, is a feature, and that linking of the transportation infrastructure with the associated development is a common and almost inherent theme of achieving funding outcomes that are required to get infrastructure off the ground. And we saw examples of the Hong Kong scenarios where associated land development and or associated lease incomes are directly attributed to achieve the necessary funding to get the project off the ground.
Maybe we move to the second element and the role of government. I think this is one that is absolutely at the heart of this discussion. The role of central and local government actually is the heart of every project, and they are the procurer, the funder, the borrower. And so I also want to refer to Minister Twyford's phrase this morning, and I think it's not the first time he's used it, about turning on the tap of financing. And I think this has raised the heckles of a number of finance providers in the room, because they are saying, I'm sitting here on a pile of cash, I'm dying to lend this in. But I think what the Minister is saying is that even if you have all these funding mechanisms there and ready to go, and as Shane was talking about earlier, Aucklanders are supporting the ATAP, they're dying to pay for this, and if you have all of the funds from financing, so the financing dollars sitting over on this side, there are these self-imposed constraints sitting in local and central government that are stopping being able to borrow more. And so they're talking about the financing settings. Are those finance settings sitting in local and central government appropriate?
Well, I think one of the first problems is that we spend a lot of time trying to, you're looking at a project where you have a funding gap and people are offering financing as the solution. Whereas the fundamental point is we have fully funded projects which have no financing. We should be financing those projects first, which are fully funded. We are not going to, doing a PPP for Penlink, if it doesn't have a funding source, a proven and tested funding source, is not financeable. It will not work. So the gap will still be there, whereas we have things like CRL fully funded and being done with not a dollar of financing. So there is potentially funding dollars in those projects that should be being recycled elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in that, and Rob sort of discussed it, there are a multitude of funding sources, and a lot of what we've talked about today, and I was up in the States in April with the delegation, and Rob's got ideas that he's seen in Australia. Our funding sources and tools will increase, but we need to unbundle those funding sources, and every project we tend to sort of think, okay, I've got a project, I need financing, but there's potentially 5, 6, 7 different funding sources within that project, and we need to be able to unbundle it, unpick it, and raise capital or finance against the specific revenue source or the type of funding that it's appropriate for. I think the other side of that is that there's an assumption generally in the market that financing is available for everything, but what needs to be quite understood is that finance is very specific depending on who's lending the money, what's it been allocated for, are you providing a loan to local government, to private sector, to this industry. We have significant prudential requirements around how we allocate that finance, and that's where if you can unbundle the revenue, you can potentially access more pools of capital, different types of capital over different tenors and whatever it may be.
Agreed. I think the additional element I'd add is the timing aspect of a lot of these things. We saw in John's presentation from PwC earlier, we have talking about the role of government. We have a timing mismatch between a lot of these monetary flows happening and the actual creation of the infrastructure. There is, there'll be benefits down the track. They'll accrue over time. They'll grow over time, and they might turn out to be slightly different than was originally envisaged. From our perspective, we see a particularly key role of government is playing an intermediary role in that, from a timing perspective, and almost bridging to an extent, the time between the creation of the infrastructure and the realising of the benefits. It's a very hard thing for private sector to take full risk on, and that's where government's coming in and providing a stable funding base and saying we commit to the project, we will fund this project in the interim, and we will take the risk on that some of those value capture issues and some of those benefits later will accrue, and that'll help us address our funding base and do more projects. That, I think, temporal aspect is a key role that government needs to play.
Yeah, and look, that idea of Crown credit enhancement for projects has been, I think, raised on a few of the other funding structures, in other sectors recently, and it's going to be a key aspect when you look at sort of the history, for example, of the PPPs in New Zealand going back to 2011. 10 years ago there were none, but there hasn't really been a complex matrix of funding sources. So while there's a lot of appeal and a lot of the things John was saying, if we're going to get things done, especially if we're going to get things done sooner rather than later, and there's an impatience in the market, then I think a simpler model or a delineation between those funding sources, as Raynor's touched on, is really important. Let's work out what the obvious ones are, pick the low-hanging fruit, and then get that done. And that's going to require a level of Crown support. Let's not dance around that.
So, hitting that topic a bit more, and perhaps a sensitive topic of when should the private capital and the role of private capital, and what I particularly want to draw on Rob and Joe and Paul too is, you've talked about when government's in, when should government be out? What is the role of private capital and private participation or ownership? It seems that if we talk about asset recycling or private ownership or participation at all in projects in New Zealand, it almost feels like you're better off talking about parking a nuclear warship in the bottom of your garden. So what role can private capital play, and are we having the right discussions around that?
Did you want to start, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of when private capital when government should be out, I think the answer might be twofold. One, I guess, is when there is no longer a significant value in the government managing an asset, and it could be done equally well or perhaps a lot better by the private sector. That's a driver. But the other one, and this is the one we've seen occur over time in Australia, is when the government's strapped for funding and needs to invest in growth projects, and they've got a bunch of lazy assets on their balance sheet. That's probably a good time to think about being out, so that you can then get on with what's required and churn that role and play that facilitating role in the economy the government's expected to play.
Because I think that's the point. Asset recycling is a form of funding. It's not a nuclear warship. We can actually use that money to get the things that we're all talking about in terms of a funding gap. And I think that goes to the point around government as well. You've got to be able to bridge to that point when those alternative funding sources, be it long-run value capture or rateable increases, are proven. Once they're proven, government can be out, you can go to the bond market, but you've got to get to that point. And so government has to step in, or central or local funding has to be available to take those risks. They're the best entity to take those risks through that period.
The other side with government is, they need to take a view that they're a giant asset manager, and like any asset manager, they maximise value. So, there will be people who sell Apple shares because they can put it into something else, and the government needs to think of itself in terms of, I'm going to de-risk this project, I'm going to get it off the ground, I'm going to use my balance sheet and, defray all that risk. But once it's maximised and the value's there and we can see that value, why wouldn't you want to realise that and then start the next project or start the next pipeline of projects? And it's sort of that mentality of, what is the role of their balance sheet?
And there are lots of good examples around, aren't there? I mean, I was speaking earlier with someone about, for example, the Waterview Tunnel. I mean, it's a fantastic piece of infrastructure for Auckland. Everyone who's gone through that tunnel has loved the fact that it's cut down the travel time to the airport so significantly. Could that be an asset subject to a long-term concession that gets told? It would seem a really easy sell. And I think we're talking about long-term concessions here. I don't think we're talking about selling the family farm to the Aussies. No one wants
That's
that.
a good point on the privatisation, because that word gets mentioned and the assumption is it's sold lock, stock and gone forever and we'll all be bereft. But there are a number of forms of privatisation which don't entail that outcome, and rather than discussing it, we just call everything privatisation and put it all to one side. Whereas a long-run concession in Australia, Rob, with the port sales on 99-year leases, have raised huge volumes of funding for other capex and investment in Australia. It's gone for 99 years as a lease, but it's not gone in perpetuity.
And how was that managed in Australia, Rob? How was the public reaction managed, and what was the public reaction?
Oh, it's very contentious. Like, it's not we've seen state elections go one way or the other based on topics of this nature. And so it generally does create a degree of ruckus in the political arena. But then you look at the outcomes, and you look at the amount of the economic growth that Sydney and New South Wales is currently experiencing, that Victoria's enjoyed over the last decade or so, and these are because some of those braver decisions have been made, and the benefits are accruing there now. If you look at the economic stability and quality of those two jurisdictions,
and recognised by the public.
Mostly. Maybe not all.
Mostly.
I think there's always a bit of heartburn initially. Like John, I'm a Melburnian, and I just remember when the first CityLink tollway went in, and there was just a sort of hue and cry about the deleterious effects it was going to have, and people using the back streets and that type of thing. But you fast forward 5 years, and you had some fantastic tunnels, and a lot of trips were a lot easier. And people were prepared to pay because it was just better. So I suppose that supports in some respects Stephen's earlier presentation, about user pays and people's preparedness to accept it, even if on the way through, it's a bit hard. But that's why we need, I think, parties of both sides to take a long-term view on infrastructure and see it as a sort of important issue for the country. It's not a partisan issue to the extent possible.
Well, that's a nice segue to my major bucket number 3, which is actually the lenders and financing itself. So banks don't lend for the life of the project, and so what are the challenges to lending, and how do we accommodate the long-term finance requirements of these projects?
Oh, look, I mean, a bugbear of mine, being a New Zealander, and I actually was listening to Bill Cashmore this morning, and he talked about each table doing a bespoke structure, and just the lack of repeatability, the lack of consistency in approach really leaves us wanting. And, I've seen a lot of banks and investors, construction firms, whoever, come into the New Zealand market. They want to put capital to work, they want to put resources in here, but there's just not a consistent approach. And you can talk about a project, but each project is a pathfinder until you start to repeat it. And unfortunately we felt with the PPP program we were getting into quite a good space, and that it was interesting on the last PPP that is still sort of about to reach financial close. I mean, the banks, Rob's team's working on that. The banks you had in that were fantastic. I mean, there's a mix of international banks who we hadn't previously seen in the market. They understood the documents, they understood the process. There was a sort of consistency in approach. So I think that's an absolutely key aspect. And it's not about saying we just need the PPP program, but we need multiple programs. If we've got the bulk housing infrastructure through CIP, let's keep that going. Let's keep the PPPs going. Let's get other financing structures going. And
it's the politicization of some of those models, financing models, is not helpful from an offshore perspective. Looking at it, there's ambiguity of funding and commitment to funding. One man's road of national significance a year later is not. From an offshore perspective, that just looks like New Zealand doesn't really know what it wants. And that's not helpful from international capital flows. Although plentiful, they will start to make choices, and uncertainty and ambiguity will either add to the cost of capital or reduce its availability.
I'd add to that the one word we haven't mentioned is equity as well, because it is true that there are limitations on the amount of and the tenor of debt finance that's available to support projects. There's plenty of it, as Grant says, and it's increasingly competitively priced and put together. But there's a lot of equity investors who are the sort of that bring all this together, who are in for the length of these concessions, who are long-term in nature, and who actually take the risk as to whether the debt finance is there later on or not. There's ample risk appetite for well-structured projects, and as Raynor referred to, the pipeline. If there's a pipeline of projects that are well-structured, then the money's there and the risk appetite's there, and the long-term risk appetite's there.
Because I think we think that this money is lining up at the door, and I know we spoke earlier that Auckland Council's a good example where they've diversified their funding into Europe over the last 18 months, but that took an enormous amount of work and commitment, and they paid, a lot of money to get into that market. But now they're in that market, they've gone back to that market to raise more money, and that capital will be here. But you've got to go and work at it and bring it in, and it's got to be fit for the funding source, going right back to that sort of starting point. But
a lot of work's been done really in the last decade to create the right environment to make New Zealand an attractive destination for private capital, to allow us to leverage off that private capital and also private expertise in areas where, for example, light rail, where there's overseas examples, there's not domestic expertise. And I think it's about continuing that and really doubling down on those things. If you want infrastructure built quickly, people who are going to come in from overseas, they need to understand it, they need to have transparency, and they need to have the belief that there's sort of commitment at a political level.
Once again, JP, you're my good segue, because I have 2 minutes and 14 seconds to go. So I'm going to put the last question to each of you, because everyone is talking about light rail. That's exactly what people are thinking in their minds, I think, with these discussions. And there are a number of funding sources and potentially different financing solutions. So what I'd like to finish with is, what do you think the best way to deliver light rail is? And I'll zip down the line.
From a funding perspective, it's going to be a mix. It's got to be, the everything that John Ranopoulos was saying about value capture should be explored by all means, yes. There will be fare box revenues as well, so there's 1, 2. The rest of it, there are benefits that extend from something like light rail all around, nationwide even. So the rest of it is government balance sheet, really. And that's regardless of whether you choose a PPP or just a construct or whatever. It's the government coffers that will pay for it, for the balance of that funding.
Yeah, I'd probably take it a step further as well and say I'm quite a big fan of the layering of taxation. I probably wasn't before going to the US, but I can see where it makes sense, where you can have additional sales taxes created for a specific reason that are ring-fenced, that the constituents can vote on whether or not they want to pay for that or pay that additional sales tax, and that comes off over time. So as the project's fully financed and through the life cycle, that sales tax gets removed. It is specifically there for that purpose. So yeah, agree with that, but I think we can take it another couple of steps as well.
We've still got 30 seconds.
Sure. I mean, I would see it as a PPP finance. If people want it financed, we've got cases where they don't. The authorities do not want financing, and that's okay. But I don't think you're going to see international financiers take what is really nascent income risk on those unproven value capture modes, funding modes in New Zealand. The government should go ahead and local authorities should go ahead and implement those funding sources to mitigate their funding requirements over time. But I wouldn't have said they were financeable, given they're a nascent tool in New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, value capture is difficult because we haven't done it before. But I suppose just echo Rob's point that from the government's perspective, I think they want to do. There's clearly a commitment to want to do some form of value capture. As John said, you've got to get it in place right up front, or you lose it. It'll just sort of slip away. But what I'd say is, if we could just sort of move one of his lines back a little bit to make sure that those who are being who are being looked at for that value capture contribution clearly have some sort of value there. And even if we give them a little bit more time to have established the value before we look to those people for a contribution, and the government sort of feels in the meantime, I think maybe that's a way of getting our cake and eating it too, which at least hopefully would allow us to kick off, because I think everyone's pretty keen to try and get moving on that.
Well, thank you all. We're actually over time. That's us done.